You ever wonder what a country's startup scene really looks like under the hood? Well, we're about to find out. We got our hands on some raw data from Startups LLK. That's the National Directory for Startups in Sri Lanka. And we're going to dig in to see what story it tells. Let's get into it.
And hey, we're not just talking about a handful of companies here. We are looking at a list of over 500 startups. We've got data on their industry, what stage they're at in their business, even their funding. It's basically a snapshot of the whole ecosystem.
So you have all this raw data. What's the story hidden inside, right? What is all this information really trying to tell us about innovation, about the future of business in Sri Lanka? That's exactly what we're going to unpack. All right, so first things first. Before we get into the weeds, let's just get a sense of the scale here. Just how big is this scene? How many companies are even talking about? The number? It's over 500. So yeah, this isn't some tiny niche community. We're talking about a really bustling, active field of entrepreneurs, and it's all right here in the data. Okay, so we've got all these entrepreneurs. Where is all that energy actually going? Let's break down the data and see which industries are, the most popular playgrounds for Sri Lanka's innovators. And wow, the data paints a really clear picture. I mean, look at this. While there's definitely a huge diversity of ideas out there, a few key sectors are just obvious hotspots. And you can see, tech-focused fields are absolutely dominating the landscape. Leading the pack, and by a pretty big margin, is IT services. You can kind of think of this as the bedrock of the whole ecosystem, right? These are the companies building the digital infrastructure that so many other businesses depend on. And IT services isn't just one monolithic thing. When you look closer at the data, it actually breaks down into these really critical areas. We're talking mobile apps, cloud infrastructure, powerful enterprise software. So it's a super diverse foundation. This quote really just illustrates the whole mindset, A company from our data, Root Code Labs, pretty much sums up the sector's ambition perfectly with their tagline. The focus is just on execution and top-notch technical skill. All right, so coming in as the next biggest sector is educational technology, or edutech as you probably know it. The data shows this really clear and growing trend of startups that are trying to totally revolutionize how we all learn. And these companies are tackling education from every angle imaginable. I mean, in the data, you see stuff like online tuition platforms, you see coding academies for kids, and a whole range of different skill development tools. It's really broad. And this tagline from MagicBit, their platform for learning electronics and coding, it just perfectly captures the spirit of the whole sector. It's not just about, sticking a classroom on the internet. It's about fundamentally rethinking how knowledge and skills get passed on. Okay, so we know what these startups are building, but the next big question is, how far along are they? Let's use the data to see where these companies are in their life cycle, from just an idea all the way to making a real impact. In a perfect world, a startup follows this nice, clean path. It starts with an idea, then it gets some traction with early customers, then it scales up its operations, and finally it hits profitability. And what's cool is the source data actually uses these exact stages to categorize all the companies. But here's what the data actually shows. And this is interesting. The vast majority, almost all of them, are right at the beginning, in that ideation or traction phase. Way, way fewer have made it to scaling or profit. The difference is pretty stark when you look at it. So the big takeaway here is really crucial. Sri Lanka's startup scene is incredibly energetic. It's full of new ideas, but it's also very, very young. Most of these ventures are still in those tough early phases, just trying to build up some momentum. And that brings us to, maybe the most critical piece of the puzzle, the money. So let's follow the funding and see where the capital is actually flowing and what that tells us about how mature this whole ecosystem is. And probably not a huge surprise here, the funding data lines up almost perfectly with the growth stage data we just looked at. The investment is massively concentrated in the earliest rounds, pre-seed and seed. That's that initial cash you need just to get an idea off the ground. The big money for scaling up, Series A, Series B, that is much, much rarer to see. Okay, let's make this a little more real with a couple of examples straight from the data. So on one hand, you've got a company like Learnware. It's an edutech, it's actually in the profit stage, but it only ever raised pre-seed funding. Then, on the other end, you have Mint HRM, a big HR platform that has raised a Series A round specifically to fuel its growth. This really shows you the two ends of the funding spectrum we're seeing in the data, from those early ideas to the very rare, scaled-up enterprise.
All right, so we've looked at the sectors, we've looked at the growth stages, and we've followed the money. Now it's time to pull it all together. What are the big takeaways from this whole data dive? Okay, so here are the key insights boiled down. First, this whole ecosystem is driven by tech, especially IT and edutech. No surprise there. Second, it's a really young scene. Most companies are just starting out. Third, the money, the investment, is almost all focused on getting those brand new ideas off the ground with seed funding. And finally, and this is the big one, when you put it all together, you see this massive gap between the huge number of early stage startups and the tiny, tiny number that have actually managed to scale up.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really important question, right? The energy is there. The ideas are there. The early stage funding is there. The data shows this pipeline that's just brimming with potential. So the big question really is, what's it going to take to help one of these 500+ startups bridge that gap and become Sri Lanka's next global success story? Now that is the story we'll all be watching.